Hello, I'm Charles Kovess, Australasia's passion provocateur. Welcome to this week's episode of the Charles Kovess Show. Whether you're watching on YouTube or Rumble or listening via one of the many podcast platforms. This is episode 193 since we started over 4 years ago. We remind you that we have a new format for the show. This new format takes into account all of the changes that we have experienced locally and globally over the last 4 years. The foundational principles of the show aren't changing. However, since so many of us are now bombarded with information and media from so many different sources, I've made the show shorter. Instead of exploring one big idea each week, I'll discuss 2 or 3 current, big impact, challenging issues, and then explore how the principles of this show can be used by you to elegantly and happily handle such issues. Instead of sharing 6 resources, I will share whatever resources may be relevant to the issues I'm discussing. The show notes will now give you links to the foundational principles of the show and my background, and my websites, my 2 websites, kovess.com and charleskovess.com, where you can find my books, details of my public programs, and details of the self-awareness and passion quest. So let's go with this week's big impact issues and how you can use the principles in this show to handle these big impacts. Firstly, government waste by all governments, but today I'm going to talk about the Victorian government. The suburban rail loop was announced some years ago by Dan Andrews, the then Premier, the worst Premier in Victoria's history. And the suburban rail loop, an underground railway in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, was predicted to cost $50 billion. Now I want you to understand how much $1 billion is. Just $1 billion. You calculate it this way. If I gave you $1,000 a day, it would take 3,000 years before I gave you 1 billion. Well, this rail loop that no one was after was budgeted at 50 billion, said the government. Well, just last month, the current projected cost of this rail loop is now $217 billion. $250 billion. You have to wonder who's earning money from this extravagant, remarkable, over-budget monstrosity. Of course, the answer is the construction industry. You then have to look at why governments make such decisions, and you have to look at the abject failure of managers in these public service departments to handle these big projects. Your grandchildren will suffer from this incredible waste. Let me give you another example. I heard just this week a government department. It budgeted for a new website. Now, I was blown away by the projected cost of this website. It was over $750,000 for a website, for a section of a department of a Victorian government department. Over $750,000, and then over the course of a few months, it's now blown out to over $3 million for a website. Can you believe that? I mean, what sort of website would it be to cost $3 million? And look at the original budget was outrageous, but to then go from almost $1 million to over $3 million, you go, who's making up these numbers? Who's going to pay this? The answer is not the government. The answer is taxpayers. So you then start to go, well, gosh, the debt that's being incurred by governments. The United States government is incurring this hand over fist. So you then go, well, can governments just keep borrowing money? Well, there is a day of reckoning. All you have to do is look at Venezuela. Governments, nations go broke. Eventually, they can't borrow money. So what we have to do, and this is where the principles come, is to, number one, be aware of this incredible waste. Number two, we have to speak up about it. We have to speak against it. We have to talk to our friends. We have to write letters. We have to ring politicians' offices in our respective electorates. This is all around the world we have to do this. And we have to make noise about it. Your grandchildren will pay the price for this unbelievable waste. And the question is, you might go, well, I don't need to do anything about this. Well, this is where your values come in. You go, well, am I worried about this for my grandchildren? If you don't have grandchildren, you might go, well, I don't give a rat's. Let them hand out all this money and I'll be dead by the time the day of reckoning comes. My message also is stop asking government for money. So many businesses I see, the government will fund this, the government will fund that. Business needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, and in some extraordinary exceptions, government can do some funding. But to have this idea that, gosh, let's go to government to start this new business, that increases the size of the problem. And then every time government gives money to a project, it requires more bureaucrats to monitor the project. Let's take responsibility for building our nations. Don't ask government for taxpayer money, because government hasn't got money. It's you paying it, and me, and Julie. The second issue is the ongoing dangers of the World Health Organization. There have been big demonstrations just this weekend by hundreds of thousands of Japanese pushing back against the World Health Organization wanting to bring in these new international health regulations and a pandemic treaty. This is an enormous threat to your freedom. This would enable Tedros Ghebreyesus to make an announcement there's a pandemic. He doesn't need any evidence. And again, you can be locked down from the decision of one bureaucrat. This is outrageous. It's unacceptable. And I was delighted to see that the state of Louisiana in America passed a state law that said no decisions of the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum or the United Nations will have any status in Louisiana. I call on other state and federal governments to do the same. This raises the issue of your desire for freedom. I urge you, keep thinking, do you want freedom? Are you willing to give away your freedom for an illusion of security to be replaced by government control? I don't. Thirdly, I heard again this week, this is hot off the press, the South Australian government has made a commitment to Aboriginal corporations that 4% of employees in government agencies are to be Aboriginal. On procurement, that 4% of procurement value is to be run through Aboriginal companies. And every government project is to involve an Aboriginal liaison and progress officer role. Now this is an extraordinary, stupid strategy, and the quote that I have from a person in government in South Australia, reading through various websites in the South Australian government, it's easy to see there's no consistency in the application of these commitments. Some departments state that the provisions only relate to a contract value up to $220,000, others state $550,000, and one in particular says $7.5 million. Now, the point is that there are insufficient Aboriginal people to meet any of the employment quotas, with only 28,500 eligible Aboriginal adult voters in South Australia. Many of them live in remote locations. The fact is, with a workforce of 165,000 staff in the South Australian government, it would have to employ 7,500 Aboriginals to meet the minimum commitment. This is not possible. This is the graft, the corruption, the nonsense that's going on. And I say again, your grandchildren will pay, because putting people into jobs because they're Aboriginal, not because they're competent, is outrageous. Is economic madness is a breeding ground for corruption. And again, what I call on us to do is to tell our politicians that it's unacceptable. Overriding all these government activities and the who and the like is the unacceptable refusal by many politicians to respond to your letters, to my letters, to the emails that we send them. You see, these politicians are our servants. They're not in charge of us. We elect them to represent us. On what basis do they refuse to answer our correspondence? I urge you to get passionately angry about this and demand answers from these politicians. Now, at the end of the day, we will throw out these corrupt politicians if enough people know about it. That's why I'm talking about it. That's why I'm asking you, in your own integrity, does this worry you? Or do you go, no, I don't worry about this? Well, I say if we don't worry about it, we pay a big price now, as shown by poor healthcare in Australia already because of lack of budget. And secondly, our grandchildren will pay a massive price. The last thing I want to talk about is my guest on the Mind Medicine program on TNT Radio. It's Clare Pain. Clare is a medical journalist and science writer with over a decade's experience of writing for doctors and the general public. Since December 2021, Clare has run projects on her website clarityonhealth.org to examine the response to the stuff that's happened over the last 4 years in Australia. In early 2022, she carried out a major survey of reasons why people took that medical intervention. And I know many people who took it who didn't want to take it. Clare got 27,000 Australians to respond, to give evidence of thousands of cases of coercion. I know many such cases of coercion. And for the past year, Clare has been focusing on excess deaths, both overseas and in Australia. She's been working closely with the Australian Medical Professionals Society. She is concerned about how the Australian Bureau of Statistics is reporting excess deaths with their new model, which has more than halved the official figures. In other words, she thinks they're cooking the books. I agree with her. She sees the current Senate inquiry in Australia, in the Australian Senate, into excess deaths as a huge opportunity for Australians to report the unexpected loss of their loved ones and to say what they believed caused their death. Clare's Substack is clarityonhealth.substack.com. Well, that's it for today's show. I hope today's show makes a beneficial difference to your life. A life that I believe is meant to be all that you are capable of making of it. If you're new to the show, check the links for the foundational principles of the show and my background, and also details of my websites. Again, thanks for watching or listening. And until our next show, may your week be full of health-giving and energy-giving passion, learning, fun, fulfillment, challenge, and ever-increasing self-awareness. Bye for now. See you next week.